morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on our fifth Sunday in Lent. Throughout our scripture this Lenten season, we have been following Jesus on various journeys. We started with Jesus in the wilderness and his temptation. We then went with Jesus in his encounters and debates with Nicodemus. We then met Jesus with the woman at the well. And last week, Jesus, when he healed the blind man. And this week, we come to the story of the raising of Lazarus. Now, the gospel lesson today from the 11th chapter of John is very lengthy. It's verses 1 through 45. Sometimes I get lost in some of those longer scripture readings, so let's recap just a little bit. The beginning of the story, we learn that there was this guy. His name was Lazarus. He was the brother of Mary Magdalene, and Martha. We also know that he is a good friend of Jesus. He and Jesus, are friends. So the opening of the story, we learn Lazarus is sick. Mary is worried, sends a message to Jesus, who says, don't worry about it. He's not going to die. And then 2 days later, he says, you know what, we should go anyway. Jesus had been traveling. So, yes, he said we should return because he says, my friend Lazarus has died, but I'm going to wake him up. And then he argues with the disciples for a hot minute about whether Lazarus is dead or just asleep. So anyway, they come back to Bethany, which is where Lazarus lived, and they find out that he had been dead for 4 days. Like, not recently dead, really dead. Mary and Martha, many people had gathered to help console Mary and Martha, who were understandably distraught. Their brother had died, and on top of that, they had sent a message to Jesus that he completely ignored. So on the road into Bethany, Martha leaves the crowd, and he heads out to sort of intercept Jesus. And I can imagine she's pretty ticked at him. And what she says is, "Where were you? If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And Jesus tells her, don't worry, he'll walk again. Or he'll live again, yes. And Martha says, yeah, I know your teachings. We will all live in the kingdom. And Jesus is like, no. He, sooner than that. And Martha sort of says another thing, like, yes, I believe in your things, but doesn't seem to really feel much better. So then Mary comes out to the road and joins them, as did sort of this gaggle of, it says the Jews, but it was likely the mourners and consolers, came out and met Jesus on the road. And she says the same thing, pretty indignant, like, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And this is when Jesus becomes deeply moved. And the scripture just says he began to weep. So we've got Jesus crying. And he asks the sisters, where is his tomb? And they go to the tomb, and Jesus says, let's roll away the stone. Most tombs of the time were sealed with a very large stone. And Martha sort of comes up to him and says, it's been 4 days. There's probably a stench. And Jesus does that thing Jesus does so very often, where his response has almost nothing to do with the question or the previous statement. And all he says is, did I not tell you that you would see the glory of God? So they rolled away the stone, and Jesus looked up to the sky, and he prayed some 2-line prayer, yells at Lazarus to come out, and he did. All we are told is that Jesus called him to come out, he did, and that there were strips of cloth on his hands, feet, and head. That's all the gospel story tells us. I feel like we missed out on a lot of details. Now, given this story is about a man who had been dead for 4 days, there are probably some pretty gory details. We know that Jesus wept. We know there was a stench. And we know that Lazarus had been wrapped in strips of cloth, again, as was the burial custom of the time. What I think we can assume is that his skin had begun to decay and was, quite frankly, disgusting. And in all likelihood, when he came forth from the tomb, he likely brought the aforementioned stench with him. The thing that really speaks to me about this story is how messy it is. It's not one of those buttoned up stories like we get at some other places in our gospel readings. It almost doesn't even seem polished. I mean, not for lack of trying. Clearly, the author and or the editors of this lesson omitted some pretty gory details. But yet we still feel like we're missing a whole bunch. Now, when I say this story is messy, I don't just mean oozing skin kind of mess. I mean like conflicted and full of grief. Jesus kind of miscalculates. The story leads us to believe that he doesn't think Lazarus is going to die, but yet he does die. Some scholars would argue that Jesus did know Lazarus was going to die, but it wasn't urgent for him to return because he knew he would raise him. But that doesn't help explain how much grief Mary and Martha went through and all of everything that happened in those 4 days that Lazarus had been dead. Not only did Mary and Martha grieve over their friend, they were mad at Jesus, as was this whole gaggle of people who had gathered to support them. And on top of all of that, Jesus lost a friend. I mean, he cries over Lazarus. He cries over all the grief. Actually, the scriptures say wept. And I think that's a little bit of where we are right now. Sad, angry, frustrated. We might even stink a little bit too. This pandemic is both totally out of our control and also completely ours to manage. We, like Jesus, received word that there's an illness. And at first, like Jesus, we may not have been too concerned. After all, it was out there, over there. But just as Lazarus did die, our crisis too has become exponentially larger. We too have come to our senses about the urgency and the severity of this issue, and we have all began to take action. Now, when Jesus was in the middle of his mess, he stops and he cries. Now, the point in the story where he begins to cry is not at all when he first learns that Lazarus has died. He knew that, and still he wept. And he likely knew that he would try to raise him and that Lazarus would walk again, but still he wept. That's because all of this, specifically death and resurrection, it's messy and it's really, really hard. Just because Lazarus did come forth from the tomb and walk again doesn't mean it wasn't hard and painful for everyone involved. Most of us know that we are doing exactly what we need to be doing right now to take back control of this crisis. We're staying inside. We aren't gathering for worship. We've canceled trips. We're doing our darndest to keep the kids occupied. And we're spending far too much time on our screens to keep our brains from turning to mush. But that doesn't mean that it's not messy or uncomfortable. If Jesus were here in person, I think he too would be crying at times. And we will come out of this, but it will be messy. We will put our world and our economy and our society back together, but not without some funny smells first. This Lent is completely unlike any other Lent we have had before. Now, I recently read a funny tweet, because let's be honest, I've been spending more time reading tweets recently, that said I really hadn't planned on giving up quite this much for Lent. I have to agree. But all humor aside, what we are doing this Lent is probably the most appropriate of all Lenten seasons. Us sacrificing so much so that everyone in our society and our human family can live. Unfortunately, it is highly likely that we will head into Easter season in much the same situation. But when this is all over, and I guarantee you it will be over, because Jesus, if he taught us nothing else, it's that death and destruction never, ever have the last word. So when this is over, and when we are finally able to gather in groups and hug our friends and hold hands to pray and sing in unified voices, that's when we will more fully understand this death and resurrection like we have never, ever before understood it. I don't doubt that Lazarus needed an awful lot of cleaning when he came forth from the tomb, just as our healing from this crisis may take an awful lot of scrubbing. I find it interesting that in this story of healing, Jesus does not touch. Jesus lays his hands on many, many other people whom he heals. In this one, he stays at a distance. And he actually sends Lazarus away when he comes forth. I can expect he's like, whoa, somebody please take him away and clean him up. Because it's messy. Jesus did the thing everyone wanted him to do. He raised Lazarus. He brought him back to life and he walked again. But not without a bunch of grief and crying and some utter stink. Because before Jesus makes it to the resurrection, there is mess. We too will come forth from this. And even though we know we are doing the right things, it will be messy in the meantime. So just as Jesus stopped and he cried when he felt uncomfortable, we may need to do the same. Let us take this Lenten story. Take a cue from Jesus that it's okay to be uncomfortable with the mess, but the mess is there nonetheless. May we be like Jesus and be comfortable in our tears. Amen.